The German invasion of Denmark in April 1940 left Denmark's overseas territories in a very precarious position. The most important of these was Iceland, the second biggest island in the North Atlantic. Originally a Danish colony, Iceland became an equal state in a personal union with Denmark in 1918. Following Denmark's capitulation, there were fears that Iceland would also be subject to German invasion, as the island was of key strategic interest for the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic, where the British Royal Navy was desperately attempting to protect its imperial trade routes from constant Kriegsmarine U-boat raiding. The key deciding factor that determined success in the battle for the Atlantic was access to well-supplied bases, which is difficult to achieve since the Atlantic is massive and doesn't have that many islands big enough to support large ports or airfields. But Iceland was in a suitable position for both the British and Germans to exploit. Although officially declaring neutrality, Iceland and Denmark's other overseas possessions would also be unwittingly roped into World War II, not by German invasion, but instead by Allied occupation. On the same day Denmark surrendered on April 9th, Britain dispatched a message to Iceland inviting them as an equal ally and belligerent into the war against Germany. This message also included a guarantee of Iceland's independence and protection from German invasion, as long as the British were allowed to use Iceland as an RAF and Royal Navy base in the North Atlantic. However, the Icelandic government refused this offer, instead preferring to declare neutrality. The following day, on April 10th, the Icelandic parliament, known as the Althing, declared that Danish King Christian X was unable to fulfill his constitutional duties to Iceland, which therefore transferred official governing powers to the Icelandic Prime Minister. Despite Iceland's assurances that they would remain neutral in the conflict, the British were terrified of the prospect that Germany may be able to invade and occupy the island. If the Germans were successful in doing so, it would give them a fantastic base for submarine and Luftwaffe operations that would inevitably devastate British trade routes in the North Atlantic. Therefore, the British Admiralty devised a plan to invade Iceland as to prevent it from falling into German hands. The first stage of the campaign was Operation Valentine, which involved British troops landing and occupying the Faroe Islands, an archipelago of Danish islands just north of Scotland. This was conducted on April 13th by 250 Royal Marines aboard the HMS Suffolk, and the operation concluded without incident. The next step was planning the invasion of Iceland. In May, after witnessing the gradual failure of the Norway campaign and German advances into the Low Countries, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared to the War Cabinet that continued negotiations with the Icelandic government was a waste of time, and only increased the risk that the Germans would reach Iceland first. Therefore, Operation Fork was approved and placed under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Robert Sturges. Icelandic historian Thor Whitehead has written extensively about Iceland's role in World War II. According to him, the planning for Operation Fork was incredibly haphazard and rushed. Sturges' force of nearly 750 Royal Marines were given only a handful of maps, most of them being poor quality. One was apparently drawn from memory. Additionally, not a single person involved in the operation could speak fluent Icelandic. Sturges' Royal Marines were transported via train to Greenock Harbour in Scotland. It was planned to be a secret mission, as it was feared that if the Germans found out about Operation Fork, they would respond with their own counter-invasion. The Marines boarded the cruisers HMS Berwick and HMS Glasgow on May 7th, but unfortunately, the boarding was poorly organised and hurried, resulting in them leaving behind most of their heavy equipment on the pier. Additionally, neither ship was designed to hold such a large capacity of people, resulting in a very crowded and uncomfortable journey. Petty Officer Stan Foreman of the HMS Berwick wrote, quote, "The majority of the Marines cluttered gangways and mess decks throughout the ship, prostrate with seasickness. One unfortunate Marine committed suicide." End quote. This suicide was the only casualty of the entire operation. The two cruisers were accompanied by the destroyers HMS Fortune and Fearless. The four ships arrived near the coast of Iceland at around 1 AM on May 10th. HMS Berwick deployed its catapult aeroplane, a Supermarine Walrus, to scout out any potential threats. It was specifically ordered to not fly over Reykjavik, the capital city of Iceland, as to avoid losing the element of surprise. But for whatever reason, Perhaps the pilot was feeling rebellious. It didn't follow these orders and ended up circling the city several times at 2 AM. At the time, Iceland only scheduled daytime passenger flights, so a plane flying around in the middle of the night was considered very suspicious. The acting chief of police, Einar Arnalds, was alerted of the aircraft, as was the Icelandic Prime Minister. However, they determined that it was most likely another British diplomatic mission, and therefore took no action. At 3:40 AM, Icelandic police spotted the British warships approaching Reykjavik harbour. Under international law, a neutral country could host no more than 3 warships in a harbour at a time. So when Arnolds was notified, he ordered custom officers to prepare a boat to approach the flotilla and order them away. At 4 AM, Royal Marines aboard the Berwick were transferred to the Fearless, which would sail into the harbour. However, due to the spread of seasickness among the troops, this action was delayed until 5 AM. By this point, a small crowd of Icelandic civilians had gathered at the pier, watching with interest. The British consul to Iceland was present at the scene as well, and approached a nearby Icelandic police officer. He asked, "Would you mind getting the crowd to stand back a bit?" The police officer responded, "Certainly," and room was made for the disembarking Marines. During this process, one Icelander decided to take action. He ran forwards and grabbed a Marine's rifle, stuffed a cigarette down the barrel, and then threw it back at the stunned soldier. He shouted, "Be careful with that one now," and disappeared into the crowd. This incident was literally the entire extent of Iceland's resistance to the initial British invasion. By 7 AM, British forces had occupied the post office and other communication centres. The key target after the city had been secured was to capture the German consulate. Fortunately, when the British arrived, they met no resistance and simply knocked on the door. The German consul, Vesna Gerlach, protested the British invasion, reminding them that Iceland was a neutral country. The soldiers arresting him simply responded with, "So was Denmark. Why did Germany invade them?" Inside the consulate, the British discovered a pile of burning documents in a bathtub, which were extinguished and seized. These papers would later be used by British intelligence as they included a substantial amount of secret diplomatic records. In the evening, once the British had consolidated their position and deployed garrisons in all major towns across Iceland, the Althing issued a diplomatic protest, claiming their independence had been infringed. The British government responded that they only intended to occupy Iceland until the war with Germany concluded, and promised to pay compensation to the Icelandic government for all infrastructure and occupation costs. Following the invasion, German headquarters did begin to devise a plan to counter-invade and capture Iceland for themselves. However, it was determined that although a German attack would most likely be successful in the short term, Iceland was ultimately too far away from Germany to be regularly supplied, and therefore the plans were abandoned. On the 17th, the Royal Marines were replaced with a garrison of 4,000 soldiers from the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions. Construction of RAF airfields began, as well as the stationing of Royal Navy ships in Reykjavik. In 1942, following America's entry into the war, the US Army stationed a further 30,000 personnel on the island. By this point, the occupying force was equivalent to nearly 25% of Iceland's total population. This led to severe social tensions between soldiers and the local population, as soldiers had intimate relationships with local women, leading to the birth of nearly 500 illegitimate children. But ultimately, the occupation saw a massive injection of funds into the Icelandic economy, as massive infrastructure projects were undertaken, including roads, railways, port facilities, and hospitals. In 1944, the Althing declared Iceland as an independent republic, separating itself from Denmark. The following year, after Germany's surrender, the occupation ended, restoring Iceland's state sovereignty after 5 years. But what about Greenland, I hear you ask? Well, I found out that Greenland actually had its own super interesting history of World War II. Like, super wacky. There was a whole conflict going on up in the north of Greenland, which is now known as the North Atlantic Weather War, which at this point I believe deserves its own video at some point in the future. So don't worry, I didn't forget about you, Greenland. I just think you're so special that you deserve your own video. And that's all from me, guys. Thank you for 2,000 subscribers. I really do appreciate it. To celebrate reaching this milestone, I've made an absolutely terrible mistake and created a Twitter. So if you're interested in mini history facts and you want to know about updates about new videos, then you can go follow me there. Other than that, thank you for watching and goodbye.